The summer heat clung to everything, making the cool, aquamarine water of the pool seem like the only escape. My stepbrother, Ethan, had always been a commanding presence, even when he wasn't trying to be. His confidence filled the space around him like an invisible aura, an unspoken charisma that seemed to draw everyone in. We hadn't known each other long, barely 6 months since our parents had decided to blend our families together, but his presence had become inescapable, especially in moments like these. I stood at the edge of the pool, adjusting my goggles, trying to appear unfazed. Ethan was already in the water, his strong, athletic frame cutting effortlessly through the surface as he swam a lap. I watched him for a moment too long before catching myself and looking away. "Hey, you getting in or what?" he called, his voice light but teasing. Water dripped from his dark hair, trailing down his shoulders and back. I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just give me a second," I said, pulling at the elastic of my swim trunks as an excuse to delay. Ethan raised an eyebrow, smirking as if he could sense my hesitation. "You're not chickening out on me, are you?" I rolled my eyes, forcing a laugh. "Not a chance." Sliding into the water, I was struck by how cool it felt against my skin, a sharp contrast to the heat that had been simmering beneath my surface for weeks. Ethan's laughter echoed as he floated on his back, his gaze fixed on the sky. "You're too uptight, you know that," he said casually. "Loosen up a bit. It's just a workout, not a competition." But it wasn't just a workout. Not for me. There was an unspoken tension in the air, a weight that seemed to settle over every interaction we had. It wasn't something I could name outright, but it was there, undeniable and persistent. Our parents' marriage had been a whirlwind. Two lonely souls finding solace in each other after difficult divorces. Ethan and I were supposed to be the beneficiaries of this newfound happiness. Stepbrothers thrown together into a new family dynamic. On the surface, we played our roles well, sharing meals, attending family outings, and even finding moments of laughter. But beneath the facade was an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. Ethan was everything I wasn't: confident, athletic, effortlessly charming. He moved through life with an ease that both fascinated and intimidated me. I, on the other hand, had always been reserved, the type to overthink every word, every glance, every accidental touch. And lately, those touches had felt like they carried more weight than they should. "Let's do some laps," Ethan said, snapping me out of my thoughts. I nodded, grateful for the distraction. We swam side by side, the rhythmic motion of our strokes breaking the silence. But even as I focused on my breathing, I couldn't ignore the way his presence seemed to fill the space around me. His movements were fluid, powerful, and entirely too captivating. After a few laps, we paused at the edge of the pool, catching our breath. Ethan leaned against the wall, his arm resting casually next to mine. The proximity was maddening. "You're getting better," he said, his voice low and genuine. "Thanks, I managed, trying to keep my tone steady." He looked at me, then really looked at me, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of us. There was something in his gaze, curiosity, maybe, or something deeper, something I wasn't ready to name. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "I didn't think we'd get along at first." I blinked, surprised by his honesty. "Why not?" He shrugged, his eyes flickering to the water. "You seemed different, quiet, like you didn't want to be here." I opened my mouth to protest, but he held up a hand, stopping me. "It's not a bad thing, just different." His words hung in the air, and I wasn't sure how to respond. He wasn't wrong. I hadn't wanted this, not at first. The idea of blending families, of sharing a home with strangers, had been overwhelming. But Ethan had a way of breaking through walls, even the ones I didn't realize I'd built. "I guess I'm still figuring it out," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his expression softening. "Yeah, me too." The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard. For a moment, he wasn't the confident, untouchable figure I'd built up in my mind. He was just Ethan, my stepbrother trying to navigate this strange new reality alongside me. The moment stretched, and I felt a strange mix of comfort and unease. There was a connection forming between us, one that felt both inevitable and dangerous. I wanted to hold on to it, to explore it, but a part of me knew that crossing that line would change everything. "Come on," he said suddenly, breaking the spell. "One more lap." I followed him, grateful for the chance to escape my own thoughts. But even as we swam, the tension lingered, an unspoken promise of something more. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the pool in hues of gold and pink, we climbed out and wrapped ourselves in towels. Ethan shot me a grin, his eyes glinting with mischief. "Not bad for a beginner," he teased. I rolled my eyes, but a small smile tugged at my lips. "I'll take that as a compliment." We walked back to the house in silence, the air between us charged with something I couldn't quite name. The day had been ordinary in so many ways, just two stepbrothers working out in a pool. But it felt like a shift had occurred, subtle yet profound. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the boundaries between us were beginning to blur in ways I wasn't prepared for. And as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen if those boundaries disappeared entirely. The next morning, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long, golden rays across the pool's shimmering surface. Ethan was already there, as if he'd been waiting for me. He stood at the edge, towel draped over his shoulder, his gaze fixed on the water, like it held some kind of secret. "Early start today," I said, trying to sound casual as I approached. He glanced over, a small, almost sheepish smile playing on his lips. "Couldn't sleep?" "Me neither," I admitted, though I left out the reason why. The previous night's thoughts had been a tangled mess, filled with images of Ethan, his voice, his smile, the way his presence seemed to occupy every corner of my mind. "Figured a workout might help," he said, dropping the towel and stepping into the pool. He didn't dive in this time, just slipped beneath the surface with a smooth, quiet grace. I followed, the cool water a welcome relief against the heat that seemed to follow me wherever Ethan was. We swam in silence for a while, our movements synchronized without effort. It felt almost meditative, like the water was washing away the unspoken tension between us. But that peace didn't last. As we rested at the shallow end, Ethan leaned back against the pool's edge, his arms stretched out on either side. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes held something else, an intensity that made it hard to look directly at him. "Can I ask you something?" he said, breaking the silence. "Sure," I replied, though my voice was barely above a whisper. He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the water before meeting mine again. "Do you ever feel like, I don't know, like you don't belong?" The question caught me off guard. It wasn't what I'd expected, but it struck a chord deep inside me. "Yeah," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully. "I guess I've always felt a little out of place, like I'm on the outside looking in." Ethan nodded, his expression softening. "Me too. It's weird, right? We're supposed to be part of this big, happy family now, but sometimes it just feels fake." His honesty was disarming. I wasn't used to this side of him. The vulnerability, the cracks in his otherwise confident facade. It made him feel more real, more human. "I get that," I said, my voice steadying. "It's like everyone's pretending everything is perfect, but underneath, it's just complicated." He smiled then, a small, genuine smile that made my chest tighten. "Exactly." For a moment, we just looked at each other, the water rippling softly around us. There was something about the way he looked at me, like he saw right through all the walls I'd built up. It was unsettling and comforting all at once. "I'm glad you're here," he said suddenly, his voice barely above a murmur. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. My heart raced, my mind scrambling for a response. Before I could find the words, he pushed off the edge and swam to the center of the pool, leaving me alone with my thoughts. When I joined him, The mood had shifted. There was a charged energy between us, a tension that was impossible to ignore. Ethan was quieter now, his movements slower, more deliberate. "Come here," he said, his voice low and steady. I hesitated, unsure of what he meant, but the look in his eyes drew me closer. We were standing just a few feet apart now, the water lapping gently around us. "Trust me," he said, holding out a hand. I took it without thinking, the warmth of his skin sending a jolt through me. He guided me closer until we were barely an arm's length apart. "Relax," he said, his tone almost soothing. "You're too tense." I laughed nervously, but his grip on my hand didn't falter. "Easier said than done." He smiled, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow down. His fingers brushed against mine as he let go, the touch lingering just a little too long. "What are we doing?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Ethan's smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet intensity. "I don't know," he admitted, "but it feels different, right? Somehow." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to pull away, to put some distance between us, but I couldn't. There was a gravity to him, something that kept pulling me closer no matter how hard I tried to resist. For a moment, everything else fell away. The complications, the guilt, the fear of what this might mean. It was just the two of us, suspended in this strange, fragile moment. Ethan moved closer, his hand brushing against my arm. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a wave of heat coursing through me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stand there, caught in the pull of something I didn't fully understand. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to find the words to answer. The space between us disappeared, and for the briefest moment, everything felt impossibly still. Then his lips brushed against mine, soft, tentative, like he was waiting for me to pull away. But I didn't. The kiss was fleeting, barely more than a whisper, but it was enough to set my entire world spinning. When he pulled back, his expression was a mix of fear and something I couldn't quite place. Hope, maybe, or relief. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, stepping back. "I shouldn't have." "It's okay," I said, cutting him off. My voice was shaking, but I meant it. I don't know what this means." "Me neither," he admitted, "but I don't regret it." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I didn't regret it either, but that didn't make it any less complicated. There were so many questions, so many things left unsaid. As we stood there, the water rippling softly around us, I knew there was no going back. Whatever line we'd just crossed, it had changed everything. "Let's figure it out," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Together." I didn't know if it was a promise or a plea, but I nodded, the weight of his words settling over me. Whatever came next, we'd have to face it together. And as we climbed out of the pool, the air between us thick with unspoken words, I couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something beautiful, or the start of a mistake we couldn't undo. The hours that followed were a haze. Ethan and I avoided each other for the rest of the day, exchanging only fleeting glances when we crossed paths in the house. It was as though an invisible line had been drawn between us, one that neither of us dared to cross again. I spent the evening in my room, staring at the ceiling as fragments of the day replayed in my mind. The feel of his hand on mine, the warmth of his lips, the quiet intensity of his voice. It was all too much and not enough at the same time. My thoughts spiraled, teetering between regret and longing. What had we done? A soft knock at my door pulled me from my thoughts. My heart leapt, and I sat up, my pulse quickening. "Yeah?" I called, my voice unsteady. The door opened slowly, and Ethan stepped inside. He didn't say anything at first, just closed the door behind him and leaned against it. The room felt smaller with him in it, the air charged with the same tension that had followed us all day. "We need to talk," he said finally, his voice low and careful. I nodded, gesturing for him to sit. He hesitated for a moment before crossing the room and sinking into the chair by my desk. The space between us felt vast, even though it was only a few feet. "I'm sorry," he began, running a hand through his hair. "About earlier. I shouldn't have—" "Stop," I interrupted, my voice firmer than I expected. "Don't do that." He looked at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Don't act like it was all you," I said, my throat tightening. "I was there too. I could have stopped it, but I didn't." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "So, what does that mean? For us?" The question hung in the air, heavy and impossible. I didn't have an answer. How could I? Everything about this was messy and wrong, but it didn't feel that way when I was with him. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we can't keep pretending this didn't happen." Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I know, but what do we do now?" I didn't have an answer to that either. Part of me wanted to erase the entire day, to go back to the way things were before. But another part of me, a part one, didn't want to acknowledge, wanted to hold on to it, to explore whatever this was between us. "I think we need to take a step back," I said finally, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "Figure out what this means before we do anything else." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Sadness, maybe, or acceptance. "Yeah, you're probably right." The silence that followed was unbearable. I wanted to say something, to bridge the gap between us, but I didn't know how. "I don't regret it," he said suddenly, his voice firm. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my ears. "Me neither," I admitted, the confession slipping out before I could stop it. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the weight of our words settling over us. It wasn't a resolution, but it was something, an acknowledgement of what had happened, of what we both felt but couldn't say aloud. Eventually, Ethan stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "I guess I should let you get some sleep," he said, his voice softer now. I nodded, though sleep felt like an impossible goal. "Good night." He hesitated for a moment before turning to leave. As the door clicked shut behind him, I felt a strange mix of relief and longing. The tension between us hadn't disappeared. It had simply shifted, taking on a quieter, more subdued form. The next few weeks were a blur of avoidance and careful interactions. We managed to navigate family dinners and shared chores without raising suspicion, but every moment alone together felt charged with unspoken words. One evening, as the sun set over the backyard, Ethan found me sitting by the pool, my feet dangling in the water. He sat beside me without a word, his presence as familiar as the tension that accompanied it. "Still figuring things out?" he asked after a long silence. "Yeah," I said, my voice tinged with exhaustion. "You?" He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Yeah." We sat in silence for a while, the water lapping softly against the edge of the pool. It wasn't the charged silence of before, but something quieter, more contemplative. "I think we made a mistake," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. "Maybe," but it didn't feel like one at the time. He was right. In that moment, it hadn't felt like a mistake. It had felt like the most natural thing in the world, like we were two pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. "I don't know what happens next," I admitted, my voice trembling. "But I know we can't go back to the way things were." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "I don't want to go back." The words hung between us, heavy and unspoken. There was no easy answer, no clear path forward. But for the first time, I felt a sense of acceptance, of the situation, of my feelings, of the complicated reality we found ourselves in. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the pool in shades of gold and pink, I realized that this was the end of something, but also the beginning of something else. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be simple, but it was ours to figure out. And for now, that was enough.